days. Now, a horrific story out of Melbourne in the last few days. Two horrific stories broken by the Australian Jewish News. Made headlines all around the world. Google it, you'll see it's gone berserk, and rightly so. A 12-year-old boy photographed being humiliated and forced to kiss the foot of a Islamic boy, a Muslim boy, was one of the stories. Another story saw a 5-year-old Jewish boy basically wetting himself in class because he was too terrified to go to the toilet, where he would be mocked and ridiculed because of his circumcision. Two horrific stories, as I said, broken by the Australian Jewish News. To talk to us about them and much more, and the rise of anti-Semitism here in Australia, shockingly, and around the world, in Europe and America, is David Adler from the Australian Jewish Association. David, welcome back to Outsiders.
Thank you, Rowan, and it's actually a dreadful thing that we have to spend some Sunday morning in Australia in 2019 talking about this type of anti-Semitic abuse. It is such a shock, it has had such an impact worldwide, because this is not what Australia is about.
Well, that footage is just, no, I shouldn't say footage, that image is harrowing, of that poor child being humiliated in that manner, forced to kneel and kiss the foot of a student only because that poor child happens to be Jewish. How widespread is this anti-Semitic bullying? Are these two isolated cases, or do you have reason to believe this is actually a far bigger problem?
One of the big problems that will get a lot of attention in the near future is that it is much wider spread than reported. We've already had about another dozen cases out of Melbourne public schools in particular. But these two cases, they have been going on for months. This is not kids woke up one day and decided to do this. There is a systematic failure in Victorian education, and this is a huge issue. The principals of the schools handled it extremely poorly, inadequately to this day. The Education Department response so far has been very poor. The local Member of Parliament, David Southwick, to his credit, has written to the Minister, who said, oh yes, we're going to investigate. But there's a lot of undercurrent.
The principal of the school, sorry James, the principal of the school wrote an email where he didn't even mention the word anti-Semitism. He sort of said, oh, it didn't happen on the school grounds, or something along those lines. Talk us through that.
Yes, I've got a copy of it here, actually, and it's extraordinary. He fobs it off. He brushes it under the carpet. He doesn't use the term anti-Semitism to describe the event. He ignores the previous abuse. There is nothing in his statement that refers to the assaults that this boy has suffered, and this is documented. Some of the injuries resulted in a hospital visit, so we have a hospital report with the injuries recorded. No reference to that. He was verbally abused as well, Jewish nigger, Jewish gimp, other insults over a period of time. He was intimidated by being followed home repeatedly, and he ended up running home and having a shower before his parents arrived home. And this is escalating.
This is heartbreaking stuff, and you mentioned Victoria.
Yes.
Victoria prides itself on its safe schools, where if you put a rainbow in your hair and anyone makes a comment, you'll be hounded down, but if you're Jewish, any amount of abuse is fine. That's how what we would learn from this story.
Safe schools is an oxymoron when it is applied in Victoria. It's all about sex, it's all about gender fluidity. They have taken their eye off the ball as to what real safety is about in schools.
That's their primary bullying
Indeed.
program, it seems. The focus appears to be entirely on that and not what's really happening in the schools. And the other case that got coverage was a 5-year-old, which is,
correct.
I mean, this prep age, that is, and this poor kid started wetting themselves in class. They were so scared and distressed by what was happening to them. So tell us about that case, because I just can't believe kids that young would be engaging in anti-Semitic language the way that child was abused.
Well, this raises an important line for the investigation, Rita. We don't assume that very young kids are born as bigots.
No.
They learn this behaviour. Where do they learn it from? Does it come from their parents? Does it come from religious institutions that they attend? I mean, we have had some cases of Islamic anti-Semitism in this country that we can trace back to some unfortunate teachings. Does it come from older peer groups? The lack of action within the schools is a worry. Only a few weeks ago, it was not such a big story, but there was a trial examination paper in Melbourne in Year 12 where one of the questions was highly anti-Israel and crossed the line to anti-Semitism. And the way such an exam gets into a paper is not one odd person. It has to go through an approval process.
Yes.
There are systematic problems in Victoria to be exposed.
James?
This is what I was going to ask about too, is that how much do you think of this climate that seems to be tolerant, I think you'd have to say, of really hideous anti-Semitism in our schools is driven by that progressive left narrative, which is very strong in Victoria particularly, about Israel, the idea that Israel is somehow a terrible oppressor. And to follow up on that, what sort of changes to the curriculum or what needs to be done in terms of oversight of schools to change that culture?
We need to understand what anti-Semitism is about. And I mean, that's a whole big subject, but you can view it like a virus that morphs. Previously, there was hatred for the religion, and we saw that expressed in things like the Inquisition. Then there was hatred for the culture, and in the USSR, Jewish culture was banned, essentially, circumcision, teaching of Torah, etc. Then there was hatred against the race, and we saw that, of course, in the Nazism when they decided that the world needed to be eliminated of the Jewish race. And now it's morphed into hatred of the Jewish state. So it is a big deal, James. It is the major driver of anti-Semitism on social media incidents. There is an important definition that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has adopted, which includes where the lines are. I mean, you can make legitimate political commentary about any country, but if you single out at a completely different level, at a completely different standard.
But
David?
we see that happen all the time, sorry, Rowan, at the UN, where Israel is held to a different standard than every other nation, where it is repeatedly condemned when, you've got despotic nations that sit on the UN Human Rights Council. So how much of an impact, you've got a body like the UN behaving like that, I mean, it doesn't get more legitimate global body than that. And you could, you'd argue it's illegitimate, but...
Another reason, Rita, well spotted.
The UN Human Rights Council, which is supposed to be the vehicle in the UN that champions human rights, looks after these things, has one standing item, item 7, on every agenda, which deals with one country in the world, Israel.
It's ridiculous.
And so there have been more condemnations.
I just want to go back to the photo because we're running out of time. But it's the photo of the Jewish boy kissing the foot of a Muslim boy that has gone around the world and has driven the kind of headlines around the world. Because it's so horrific. How much of a role? I mean, kids don't make this stuff up themselves. So a Jew kissing the foot of a Muslim, that has its roots in God knows what. Theological or religious thinking or text, but surely we need people to be calling this stuff out. I mean, Josh Frydenberg was terrific. He called it out. Are we going to get some Islamic leaders saying this is unacceptable? What we saw was disgusting, because that image, often it is the image that just disgusts the world, and people say, how did it come to that?
Look, this case is a mixture. It's as we see very often. We do see neo-Nazis linking up with Islamists occasionally. I mean, even through World War II, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, became a friend of the Nazis and they were collaborating. We saw in America, David Duke compliment Ilhan Omar. What do they have in common? Anti-Semitism, hatred of Israel.
They have nothing else in common.
We've seen it in this case. That particular photo is not only Islam, it's Nazi-style humiliation, the public humiliation. And let me tell you, this is going to escalate in the next 24 hours.
But the kids who were tormenting that child weren't just...
It's going to escalate because There will be a police report later today about a threat the boy has received from an older Muslim student at the same school. Although the principal is trying to avoid the issue, there has been a threat from a Year 10 student, and that will be a subject to a police report today. It's got so much foul language in it, I can't. But
so there's more on this story.
I'll slaughter you is included in the threat.
Thank you for that, David. Rita?
Oh, that's shocking. I want to get your reaction to the Education Department, because you mentioned the principal, but he wouldn't probably release that statement without the Education Department's say-so. So how deep is this problem in Victoria, and is it prevalent in other education departments throughout the country?
It seems to be worse in Victoria. It certainly does exist elsewhere. As I said, we saw the exam paper earlier in the year. It was very, very difficult to get the Education Department and the Minister focused on that. Again, David Southwick did a good job. Rabbi James Kennard, who's the principal of Mount Scopus there, has been following it up and frustrated at lack of results in trying to identify who was responsible for that. There needs to be a proper investigation. It does seem that, you know, there has been a leftist anti-Semitic influence in education in Victoria that is...
And just quickly, I just want to ask, are Jewish parents pulling their kids out of public schools because of issues like this? Are you hearing that, or has it not got to that yet?
Well, these two cases, it's occurred. We don't want to get to the stage where Europe, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, it's now regarded as dangerous for Jewish kids to attend public schools.
Dreadful. David Adler, always great to see you. I'm sorry it's such a horrible circumstances, but it's important that this issue be exposed, and Victorian education authorities get on to this. Victorian MPs, get on to this, please. David Adler, thanks so much.
Thank you.